Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of our top stories, including, is there room for a more strong federal government nowadays? The discussion is interesting. We have an article that actually explores some of the legal ideas behind it that we will be referencing, and we have a second article talking about a minimum wage change across the entire nation that may be coming. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Hey, but that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So to stage our first article, is the federal government needing of more powers nowadays? Should we not necessarily throw federalism to the side, but reconsider it? Is there a idea out there that would satisfy everybody in the form of governance and still allow some level of play on a state level, but really concentrate power in a federal way? I think it's an argument that doesn't necessarily need to be had, because I do believe that we have a good balance now, and especially because I want each state to be able to have more autonomy because they are more directly in contact with the populations that they oversee. But it doesn't mean that we have to dismiss a case outright. It doesn't mean we can't explore it. So I want to know what your opinions are. And maybe people bring up points that neither of us had thought about, who are on the side of maybe a little bit more federalism. So the article itself comes from Law and Liberty, and the headline reads, "Gaming the Constitution." Now, this author is actually pushing back against some of the points a different critic of the federalist system is making. And I want to read the third paragraph, not the whole thing, but a little bit of it, in order to provide that extra context that I can't, because I'm either not smart enough or because this actually is a much deeper conversation than I'm giving it credit for. Quote, "But Siegel's position goes well beyond Marshall's sound interpretation of the Constitution. In maintaining the bank's constitutionality, Marshall cited the powers Congress is explicitly granted over the sword and purse, taxation, borrowing, regulating commerce, and directing the armed forces, and accepted Congress's judgment that the bank was conducive or convenient, hence necessary and proper to achieving those purposes. By contrast, while paying occasional lip service to the principles that the Congress's powers are constrained by the Constitution and the rights of the states and individuals, Siegel's game theoretical approach is essentially open-ended, except where the Constitution text specifically precludes it. Siegel endorses a cost-benefit collective action treatment of public policy problems. In situations in which some states would regard themselves as better off from particular collective action, but others find themselves worse off, Congress is authorized to take action whenever it rationally determines that its intervention would help the one group of states more than it would harm the other," end quote. And honestly, I feel like this is the most concise way throughout this entire article that the argument is laid out. Are we a nation so large yet so similar in culture that we can start doing cost-benefit analysis across the entire population and overpower the state governments that are active in the United States? And you may be saying, well, why does it matter if we're a homogeneous society? Why does it matter if we are all similar enough in culture? Because the reason that distinct governments exist to represent distinct populations, or distinct governments exist to govern and represent, in the case of the United States, the states are a tool of representation on the federal level, at least. These are all there to represent distinct populations. If the populations are no longer distinct and the cultural values among them is close enough that you can say, well, some of these eccentricities, some of these behaviors are outliers in the society as a whole, not just in a distinct population, then you can start to make an argument for having a more in-depth cost-benefit analysis that runs across states. Say North Dakota and South Dakota both say that a land requisition act in order to get a new pipeline for oil flowing through there from Canada will be detrimental to their state. But then you have states like Texas, where oil refineries may be, or Oklahoma. Let's even say that. Oklahoma, let's say they make a whole bunch of refineries. And both of those states make a claim saying, well, actually, even though it's going to hurt them and it's going to hurt their land value and it's going to possibly hurt their relations with the tribes and indigenous people that live in parts of North and South Dakota, the benefits are going to be so good to our economy and then to the U.S. as a whole that we want to override them. Very often, right now, we have a system of negotiation. We have a system saying, what can we do to allow this? And also with 50 other states, technically you can make the pipeline go somewhere else and still route it to Texas and Oklahoma. But in this system, the argument would go, well, it's actually going to be cheaper if we go through North Dakota and South Dakota, and it will bring more benefit to Texas and Oklahoma. Therefore, we're going to override North Dakota and South Dakota's opinions on this matter. Basically, we are going to use our force as a federal government to say that the states do not matter. We are directly violating their sovereignty because technically, in our system, the federal government represents us on an international level, but to some degree, we are our own technical sovereign nations. We are just in a compact with one another that allows us to have interstate commerce between them. In effect, in actuality, we are not a sovereign nation, but in principle, the idea was that all these places, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, Georgia, they needed each other to survive, but they could have very well broken off and become their own independent territories and own independent places. So we had to make a sort of bargain in order to keep them together because the financial prospects of a nation of the beginning of the United States broken apart would not end well. And that's why everybody was willing to concede so much. But the point that I'm getting at is that this is directly violating the sovereignty set up in our federalist system. The idea that these states can govern themselves and they can have their own interpretations of law. They can have their own constitutions. I mean, there are constant battles between state legislators, or more, let's actually put it more poignantly, between state courts and the residents of those states that have the Supreme Court of each state that issue rulings that directly affect all the people within it. One recent one was in Montana. There have been other ones. Another recent one was in Tennessee, and you can go look up some of these cases yourself. The one in Tennessee was about the right for gender-affirming care, as it was called, and Montana, the other one was the right to clean air, I believe. So you can look up all these cases. But in a federal system, a system that is devoid of any state process, these would just be simply appellate courts, or these would be smaller functionaries of the federal court. Rather, these Supreme Court cases in each of these states can determine what the law is in these states, and if they go unchallenged, they won't necessarily find their way up to the Supreme Court. So what is the proper purview? What is the system to look like if the federal government is to actually be so powerful that it can directly override any of the state's interests? More importantly, we will discuss what it would look like. I want to focus on the question of why we should do this, or why someone can argue that. If we are of such a unified mind on every given issue, or at least on particular issues, let's say Alabama and New York. Right now, they have very different opinions. The populations have very different opinions on what abortion rights should be. Let's say that in the future, they're of such close nature on these sort of issues that you're not actually legislating and therefore legislating a population and basically throwing out half of it. Rather, you're only regulating or legislating and affecting the lives of the fringe of the population. That is, in theory, a better way to not upset the balance, cause any sort of political instability. So when a culture is more homogenous, or at least has the same, because homogenous normally people take it to mean as a racial thing, but I mean as a cultural thing. If it's culturally homogenous and the values are so closely aligned, you can make an argument for having a more powerful federal government, or even larger quote-unquote states, larger districts that are able to represent the population better. But that feels as though we are long off from that. We are not close to that sort of system nowadays. Texas is a very different state than Washington. Washington is a very different state than Montana. Montana is very different than Michigan. Michigan is very different than Nebraska. Nebraska is very different from Maine. All of these places have very distinct cultures. I could see an argument for a territorial system. The Northeast, the South, the West, some similarities exist between all of those, but even between the states, there are going to be differences. And that's why our federal system works so well. We are allowed and able to address these differences in the quote-unquote laboratories of democracy, the laboratories of freedom, in each individual small location and elevate it to a larger question if it needs to be addressed on a federal level. There are stages to our process, and by dissolving the layers between these stages and inferring or implying that the federal government needs to be directly involved in all of these, one, it's too much. I wouldn't say too much power, because there are federal governments that can do it without necessarily overreaching, though it is very far and few between, because government is made out of people. People with power tend to overreach and want to seize more of it, at least the ones that yearn for power in the first place. Good men can leave power behind, but they are far and few between because we are fallen people, so on and so forth. But it is beyond what I feel as though a lot of people would be comfortable giving that much leeway to a government, giving that much influence, to have the ability to simply make us numbers on a sheet and say, this is a cost-benefit analysis. Oh, the cost-benefit analysis says North Dakota and South Dakota, the people of those states, their opinions on this don't necessarily matter. Their representatives don't necessarily matter. It will always turn into a system that is debasing, that directly hurts the direct representation model of the United States that we have, but also it will tend towards the big states, because anything that would benefit the big states is going to have a better cost-benefit analysis. The costs are going to be lower than the benefits, more than likely, and therefore it will just be a tyranny of the majority in a democratic system. And that is why the system that we have is so, I don't want to say perfect, but it is beautiful in that it is layers upon layers of checks and balances between the federal, the state government, within the federal government itself, to pretend as though this system, which has been robust for 250 years, will not change is stupid in my mind. That's why we have to explore these sort of ideas. But we are not at a place where we are homogeneous enough to have one ruling government that can actually and effectively represent all the needs of everybody without, or even address all the needs of everybody without there being some sort of issue and overreach and possibly even bloat. Another reason that the state governments, besides the fact that they can directly relate to their populations, is they feel the pain of their populations. They know where the pain points are, and they're more quickly able to address some of these issues because the resources are locally directed. They don't have to be spread across multiple areas. So that's not to say that a more federalized system would take any of these things away. That is still a possibility. You could pool all the National Guard resources at each state and still keep them assigned there, or you could have special funds for each place. But as it's constructed right now, it would be hard to make a proper shift and honestly basically destroy the state system with its system of sovereignty currently. But that is something that I think you should go explore. I think you should go read this article, because while the authors are definitely not super nice to the other gentleman on the other side, making the argument for a less federalized system, a less separated powers system, I think it's at least worth exploring. And with that said, we'll move on to our second article, which is another conversation about the federal level, but also how states are dealing with something that may be coming down the pipe. This article comes from the Arkansas Advocate, and the headline reads, "Minimum wages are increasing in nearly half the states this year." And this is a conversation that always comes up every 4 years, maybe every 6, and I would honestly say every 2. We need to increase the minimum wage. We need to stop allowing these different states to basically have a race to the bottom. We do not want to have lower costs in Idaho and higher costs for labor in Washington, and then have companies leaving Idaho, so on and so forth. The argument would be, well, what's the value add of being in Washington? Are there things that give you benefits besides labor costs, so on and so forth? But not trying to dismiss the conversation, just trying to summarize some of the arguments, counter-arguments, so on and so forth. But I've said so on and so forth about 5 times now. Let's actually get on to the so on and the so forth. So the first few paragraphs go into the battle between states on their current prices, what some of them are sitting at, and I just want to give that for a little bit of context. Quote, in many states, the minimum wage is automatically adjusted upward as inflation rises. But voters in several states, including deeply red ones such as Alaska and Missouri, chose in November to significantly increase their minimum wages this year. Michigan will see its minimum wage jump from $10.33 to $12.48 on February 21st after the state Supreme Court concluded the legislature subverted residents when it adopted but then significantly amended voter-initiated ballot measures in 2018 to raise the minimum wage and mandate paid sick time. End quote. So this is one of the most interesting things that I wanted to pull from there is the inflation-adjusted wages. I think if you're going to do a minimum wage, that is the way to do it. Rather than to constantly have a clock that resets that you can go in and say, okay, we're going to address it after 4 years, and then we arbitrarily pick a number, which it's not technically arbitrary because there are lots of studies that senators and congressmen look at to determine what the average cost of living is across the United States. I'm not trying to demean those people, but instead, or demean the senators and congressmen and also the people that make those reports. But having a simple report that says inflation has risen by this much and it has affected the costs of these goods. You do a core consumer price index and you look at that rather than necessarily the overall inflation, because that includes industrial inflation, things like that, costs of hotels, which not everybody has to experience. You just do core inflation. And then you apply that directly to the minimum wage. You have a recurring clock that doesn't say, hey, now it's time to address it. You have a recurring clock that says, okay, every 4 years, this is when you initiate the new minimum wage. And in effect, that is actually just keeping up with inflation. That is just keeping this power of the consumer, the power of the pricing power of the money, exactly the same. So that is saying to the consumer, okay, 2 years ago, you were able to buy 2 apples with your $1. And at this point, you can buy 1.5 apples with that $1. We're just going to set the clock back to 2 apples at $1 because that's why you do core inflation for the products that everybody consumes. And you make sure that their purchasing power is exactly the same. I'm not going to say that I would love that as a minimum wage. I think the free market can actually set these prices pretty effectively for the value of the people who work there. But the point I'm getting at is if you're going to take it on like this, why not make it systematic where you don't have to touch it? You don't have to worry about human influence. There doesn't have to be a battle over it. The reason that they don't want to is because they want there to be a battle over it. They want to get concessions for it. They want to have it as a political issue in order to keep bringing up. But in this case, this is a great example. Have one that automatically adjusts via inflation. And you can do it on a state level as well and start with what it is now and start doing it for inflation. And you say maybe every 50 years there's a reevaluation, every 25 years, every 10 years there's a total reevaluation. But we need to get this issue off the chopping block, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean that I would be willing to just die on this hill. So let's actually explore some of the other ideas that this author goes into here. Quote, for Camilla Hobbs, the Missouri law means that she can expect at least an extra 31 cents per hour once she returns to work at Arby's following maternity leave. This year's new minimum wage of $13.75 isn't enough to live comfortably in Kansas City, she said, but every bit helps her afford the basics, such as diapers and baby formula. Quote, it won't be a huge difference, but it'll still be a little bit of something for us, said Hobbs, 33, who is also an organizer for a group advocating for low-wage workers. And inflation has significantly eroded the buying power of the stagnant federal minimum wage. Advocates say raising wage floors helps lower wage workers cover the rising costs of essentials and boost the economy by putting more money into the pockets of people who are likely to spend it, end quote. That is fair, that argument, that if there's more money in circulation or there's more money in people's pockets, they'll be able to spend more. Yes, that's true. That also is what triggers inflation because more people are able to spend higher. The whole point of inflation, the way that we handle inflation, is sucking money out of the economy. We make it extremely hard for people to get loans, which means less money is flowing that way. And on a natural cause and effect loop, the cost of things go up in order to make sure that less people are able to buy them. And I don't mean, they're mechanically changing things so people can't buy them. In order to regulate it on a natural level, the prices of things go up, meaning less people are able to buy it, therefore less money flows. And then companies say, okay, hey, we're not at that ideal mix. We're actually losing money now. They lower the price until people are able to afford it again. And that is how the market self-regulates. In theory, in practice, there are lots of different and things that go into it, possible corporate structures, collusion in some cases, monopolies. But the point being that to simply say, oh, this is the only solution, this is exactly what will happen, no, it could actually spur more inflation on and upwards. And also, raising the minimum wage has almost always done this. We have studies that the average cost of things go up if the minimum wage actually increases in areas. And that's because there's more money that flows into the economy. Therefore, more people are able to afford some of the more high-priced goods. Therefore, the companies can actually charge more for them. But also because the supply is a little bit more strained, the prices go up. This is trodden on territory, and the arguments will go back and forth. And that's why I think the first solution that I proposed, if we're going to do a minimum wage at all, which I don't necessarily think we should, because the free market could be able to evaluate these sort of things, this needs to be cut off at the knees rather than the constant conversation that keeps coming back and back and back. If Republicans want to get it off the table, say inflation adjusted, there you go, done. I don't want to ever hear from you again. And if Democrats want to keep it on the table, then it will be up to them in order to explain why the inflation-adjusted one is not good enough. But hey, that's enough on all of that. I think they were both very interesting articles. If you want to go check them out in the link in the description, all of them are there. You can go read them. But before you leave, let's play our Daily Delight, or I'll tell you about our Daily Delight, and you can also go look at it in the link in the description below the like and subscribe button. This one comes from our friends over at Woo Globe. The puppy's adorable reaction to seeing its owner's brother is pure love and hilarity. And honestly, this video is amazing. The dog's so excited. And I think that if you haven't smiled yet today, because, it's very possible that you've had a really serious day, go and watch this video. It'll bring a smile to your face. And also read up on that first article specifically. It's very long. It took me about 20 minutes to read through all of it. Then again, I am a slow reader compared to most. But with that said, if you want to check out the Tuesday and Thursday show, it's 6 and 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. That will come out here on the YouTube channel or over on the RSS feed, which you can look at on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at your DailyFlip, where you can go there and follow that. And that's where I post the links to every single video that comes out on YouTube and also the RSS. So with that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.